Welcome again to the Pacific Southwest and Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center series. So we are here today to learn with Steve about secondary traumatic stress and educator well-being. What a time to sit in that conversation. And this is part of our larger body of work around multi-tiered systems of support, always and now, and how our virtual practices shifting and causing us to both sit in a lot of inquiry and a lot of expansion with how we arrive at serving the young people that we're charged to serve. And how do we do this work both with a concentration on the systems change and interruption work and on the practices change and interruption work, and sometimes continuation work. So today we get to zoom in on a practice, which or many practices around secondary traumatic stress and educator well-being. Of course, we are funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and so we are grateful for the funding. And we also just want to disclaim that all opinions and content expressed is ours only and doesn't necessarily reflect that of SAMHSA. Let's move forward. As I mentioned, that we are a combo of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And so we just want to start off by giving acknowledgement and recognition that our centers, both the SMART Center at the University of Washington, where Northwest is housed, and the Center for Applied Research Solutions, where the Pacific Southwest MHTGC is housed, is located and occupies Indigenous land. And so we want to recognize and affirm that we are conscious and purposeful in understanding where we come from, and also to whom we pay homage to for the ability to provide services on the land that we reside. Thank you. So we're going to move forward. All right. So speaking of land, this is where we do land in our Mental Health Technology Transfer Center network. So we are a conglomerate of multiple centers across the country to provide no-cost mental health and school mental health technical assistance, consulting, coaching, webinars, more webinars, even more now, training, etc. And like we said at the beginning, this is a combo effort of both the Northwest region, serving Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and the Pacific Southwest, a Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, serving the US Pacific Islands, Hawaii, California, Nevada, and Arizona. And even if you're not from that region, you are very welcome, as I saw some of you from Philly and Illinois, to join us for the learning. Okay, so this series is based on 3 fact sheets that Susan Barrett and team created with us last summer. And then throughout the fall, and I saw Natalie Sedano's with us last fall, many of you also joined us for learning about the Interconnected Systems Framework, which is a way to both conceptualize our multi-tiered systems of student support and school mental health work combined together, Interconnected Systems Framework. And so all of those fact sheets and also the recorded webinars are up on our website, and you can also check those out if you want to get some priming about where this conversation sits and how and why we're bringing this up for both of us, for both of our centers. All right. Thank you. Okay, so like I said, Steve, and we're almost there, Steve, this is the second session as a part of Module 1. So we are kicking off this week with the Interconnected Systems Framework West Coast Party, enhancing multi-tiered systems of support and integrating student mental health, like I said, and wellness through systems, data, and practices. And so this week we were concentrating on Interconnected Systems Framework in virtual conditions. Many of you learned with Susan on Tuesday. And on Thursday is when the USC team joins us. And so today, we're starting us off talking about secondary traumatic stress and educator well-being, because we know that even if this wasn't pandemic times and this wasn't COVID times, that mid-October is one of the really hardest times for educators. And by educator, I mean school mental health professionals, both if you're from the classroom, in the hallways, in the offices, in the county, in the district, at the state, no matter where you are, this time tends to just be really hard. And then on top of that, pandemic times, and on top of that, all that we're holding. So today's session couldn't be more timely. We do really encourage you to join us for modules 2, 3, and 4. So we'll be we'll be deep diving into interconnected systems framework and trauma-informed approaches, both the systems and practices, and tiers 2 and tiers 3. That's coming up in December. Interconnected systems framework and equity. Steve will come back and we'll apply this conversation with more specific attention to how to support Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our education systems. And then we'll end with a town hall in January. So we hope you all join us then. Okay, that's enough intro. We do just want to name that this work is team work. So I know that many of you are not here with colleagues, but we hope that as you engage in this conversation around systems and practices and data, that the outcomes, that this work around educator wellness can sometimes happen on our own. And I know that Steve will bring that up when we talk about self-care, but is deeply embedded in our systems attunement to educator collective care. So this work is really asks us to come into our school mental health leadership through a lens of interdependence. So without further ado, we're going to move forward, and Steve will come on screen. and actually, Steve, if you can even advance the next slide and show and do the intro. Great. So I'm a big fan of people being able to introduce themselves. So Steve, I'm gonna mute myself and go off screen and hand it off to you so you can introduce yourself and then lead us in learning. And we're really thrilled, Steve, that you're here with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lior, for your opening remarks. And you saved me about 10 minutes of time. So no, just kidding. It's really wonderful, all the work that you and your team are doing. And it's a pleasure to be here with each of you today. What I'm going to do is I'll introduce myself, who I am, and then I'm actually going to turn off my camera so that we can focus on the slides and some of my comments and opportunities for you to sit and reflect on some of the content that I'm sharing. We did this a while ago, and I think it worked effectively for those of us that were listening and participating in the webinar. And so we kind of eliminate some of that extrinsic load, and you can focus on the content at hand. So I am Dr. Steve Hydon. Please just call me Steve. I've been at the USC Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work. I'm going on my 21st year. And for the last decade or so, I've been engaged in research around secondary traumatic stress, its impact and causality, primarily for those individuals working in schools, teachers, mental health professionals, social workers, custodial staff, principals, everybody that kind of has an impact in the school environment and community. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you concepts around secondary trauma. And I've had the privilege of working in a few different capacities within these concepts. One capacity is as a consultant for the U.S. Department of Education, where I've been able to train on a similar condition that we refer to as compassion fatigue, resiliency, and self-care strategies. I've also been able to present in some different locations, not only across the country, but in different capacities across the country. So I've presented for schools, but also for public defenders, court interpreters, law enforcement. And I mention all that to say that when we think about secondary trauma, and I'm going to get into kind of a walking definition to frame us with STS, I'll refer to secondary trauma as STS for brevity. As we think about it, it can really impact anyone, anywhere, in any type of helping profession. So in that way, it doesn't discriminate. There's no age limit. There really is. It's a condition that anyone working, again, in a lot of these different settings can experience and are at risk for it. And that's why it's important to have some conversation about it. Okay. What I'm going to do is just turn off my video so we can focus on this. So the overview today will be this. I'm going to walk us through, again, an understanding of secondary traumatic stress. I'm going to talk about resiliency. I think you can't really do any of this work unless we're having some conversation about resiliency. I'm going to look at why, in the very nature of work you're doing, you may be at risk for STS, the signs to look for, and then the impact of STS across these different 6 life domains. And then I'm going to talk a little bit and shift gears about self-care and some new literature that actually looks at self-care as self-accountability, which I think is kind of an interesting concept to think about. I'm going to talk a bit about pillars of thriving. And then the last part of our day will be sharing with you a new web-based platform that went live back in February called STAT, Support for Teachers Affected by Trauma. And I'm actually going to toggle back and forth between my slides and the actual online learning platform so you can actually experience a little bit about what it's like, its functionality, and its purpose. So I've got a quote up here. And I want us to spend some time just thinking about this quote. Because there are so many of you, we won't have a chance to do breakout sessions or to ask people to sort of respond and participate in that way. But I am going to ask you from time to time I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask you to think and reflect on what it is that I'm sharing, how you're thinking about it, how it might apply to you or perhaps a colleague or a friend or someone that you know. So the quote up here reads, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. It's a Leonard Cohen quote. I'll read it again. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. As you're thinking about that, for me, it sort of means that we don't have to be perfect in everything that we do, even though we try so hard. And that in fact, those imperfections allow us to see things differently and allow us to perhaps work more effectively or have more impact on the client systems that we're working with. So forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. There's a crack in all of us. And that's sometimes how the light, how the learning, how the discovery gets in. Okay. If you were to Google secondary traumatic stress, and I've done this before, you'll get well over 2 million hits, right? I mean, there's just so much literature and articles and studies out there about the concepts of secondary trauma. So I'm going to walk us through kind of a framing definition of secondary trauma as we think about our work together this afternoon. And so that says that when we work so intimately and closely with individuals that have experiences with trauma or hardship or devastation, that we actually start to take on some of what they're experiencing with regards to depression, loss of appetite, substance abuse, etc. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit more in some future slides. It's often chunked out into avoidance, thought intrusion, and arousal because we really want to help the individuals that we're working with. Okay, so one more time, that we work so intimately and closely with individuals that have experiences with trauma or hardship or devastation that we actually start to take on some of what they're experiencing. And I'll reveal some of those conditions in just a second. And that it is often chunked out into things like avoiding places and persons and areas, thought intrusion, and arousal. Again, because we have this desire and this yearning to want to help the individuals that we're working with. And I give you that definition because in psychoeducation, there's some research that says that before we get into definitions, we have to be just aware of the language and the vocabulary and that these conditions kind of exist before we can just jump into didactic content. So I ask you to just think about the fact that this is a very real condition. It's out there, and we'll talk a little bit more about why you might be at risk and then what we should be doing about it. As I mentioned earlier, SDS can happen kind of to anyone, anywhere. So if you were to look at the DSM-5, say, we have psychologists or social workers, other mental health professionals in the audience, the DSM-5, in order to be diagnosed with something, you usually have to present some of the symptoms for a period of time. Like depression, you have to present depressive symptoms for at least a minimum of 2 weeks. Whereas STS has some really interesting conversations with colleagues of mine across the country, and it can kind of creep up on us and set in at any point in time. There's no time frame. And that it's not a weakness, okay? So it's not a bad thing that you might be experiencing STS. It's what we think about is it's something that we want to recognize that's out there so that we can attach some language, some vocabulary to it. We can get familiar with it so we know what to do about the conditions and how to perhaps mitigate its impact across some of the domains that I'll reveal a little bit later. There's also a concept on the slide that we refer to as compassion satisfaction. And incidentally, STS is interchangeable with some other similar, phenomena and conditions: vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, right? So we use a lot of these terminologies interchangeably. Today, we're going to focus more on the secondary traumatic stress piece. Compassion satisfaction posits that we actually derive sort of enrichment and pleasure from working with individuals who need our help, working with individuals who have experienced some type of loss or devastation or trauma. And because we actually feel like we can do good work, and we enjoy the fact that we know that, and we get satisfaction that we're compassionate about working with others who have experienced challenges, because we know that we understand where that comes from, and we believe in the work that we're doing. I don't think you can talk about any of these concepts unless we're talking about or have an understanding of resiliency, right? And so I think if you were to sit for a moment and ask yourself, gosh, if someone were to ask me, what does it mean to be resilient? What would come to your mind, right? This ability to bounce back effectively and quickly from trying circumstances, right? Getting up the 10th time after you've been knocked down 9 times, right? That as human beings, we have the capacity to not only to bounce back quickly and effectively, and that bouncing back doesn't take too long of a period of time. The nature nurture is sort of this. It was really interesting. I was presenting in Las Vegas a while ago, and I asked sort of, are you born being resilient, or do you learn that along the way? And I've sort of come up with, you're sort of born with the innate ability to overcome trying circumstances. So in that regard, it's kind of a combination of both. We're born with it, but then we learn, especially in early life, how to deal with trying circumstances by facing them, by looking at others, and sort of those others are models for us, and how do we overcome difficult circumstances. So it's an interesting concept, this concept of being resilient. And are we born with it? Do we learn it along the way? Seems to me it's a combination of both. And then the other concept out here is post-traumatic growth, right? This ability not only do we bounce back from trying circumstances or traumatic circumstances, we actually improve our outlook on life. We improve our goal orientation. We improve our relationships with others. We actually grow from that particular experience. So what are some risk factors for STS? The first one I have up here is countertransference. And in social work, those of you who are social workers out there, right, this is kind of social work 101. The idea that countertransference essentially says that the person that we're working with or have interactions with perhaps remind us of someone or something in our life. That could be a positive someone or something. It could perhaps be not so positive experience. And so it's this idea that the person in front of you perhaps reminds you again of someone or some experience, either in your past or perhaps even currently in your present. Personal experiences with traumatic events, that perhaps you have your own personal experiences with traumatic events that have gone unresolved. You haven't quite fully negotiated or navigated that event. Direct contact with children's stories. That's because children and adolescents are these vulnerable populations. And so if we're working directly with these children's stories or adolescents, it could make us susceptible to secondary trauma. Helping others and neglecting your own needs. We're going to get a lot more into that during the self-care phase of my presentation. But literally, this suggests that you're spending so much time helping others that you neglect taking care of yourself and stepping back, turning it off, letting the work go, and enjoying everything else that your life has to offer. And then empathy versus sympathy. Once again, I'm a social worker by trade, and we're taught to be empathetic, right? And how do we sort of empathize with the individuals that we have in front of us versus feeling sorrow for that sympathy. And so this idea that being empathetic or experiencing countertransference doesn't mean you're going to experience STS, but coupled with some of these other risk factors could make you susceptible to the condition. I'm going to do one more slide, and then I'm going to pause and just ask you to kind of reflect thus far on what I've been sharing with you. So what are some things to look for? And we're going to see some of these in the impact slides, but I'll mention some of them briefly here. This intense connection to those you help, that you not only care about the person you're working with, but you're overly invested in making sure that they're okay, that this person can't make it without you. And what I like to think is it's okay to stay connected to the process, but not attached to it. All right. So this over connection to the individuals that you're helping. Increased irritability, right? Maybe short tempered, or the smallest little things get to you. There's no saying out there, don't sweat the small stuff. And I like to think that often I don't sweat the small stuff, but sometimes those small things just become irritable and they didn't used to. So that could be a sign that you might be experiencing secondary trauma. Right? That you're too hard on yourself, pushing yourself too hard, that there's so much need out there that you can't afford to take time away from yourself, that you feel like you have to do it all. However, when this happens, you stop seeing the worth of working on a team or the importance of not pushing yourself beyond your capacities. The other sign out here is you may experience feelings of inadequacy, low self-esteem, or conversely, feelings of grandiosity. Right? A lack of focus or the inability to concentrate. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the cognitive impact of secondary trauma. And you may develop symptoms similar to PTSD, such as sleep disturbances, intrusive thoughts, feelings of being sad, frightened, over anxious. And I mentioned earlier with the definition that it's oftentimes chunked into issues around isolation, avoidance, and withdrawal. And we'll explore that a little bit further. I'm going to stop right there and just ask you to take a minute to kind of reflect on the definition of STS, why you might be at risk for STS, and then what are some of the signs to look for? And as you're thinking about that, I'll get into the impact. So these next two slides will walk through 7 different, what I like to refer to as life domains. I'm going to stop after each slide, again, just for purposes of you thinking about this and its impact it might be having on you, or perhaps impact it might be having on a colleague or a friend, someone else that you know, okay? So the emotional impact, there's basically 4 human emotions, right? Mad, sad, glad, and scared. For those of you out there who know Dr. Robin Gurwitch, she gave a presentation a long time ago. I was there. And so I stole her sort of description of emotions. I know many of you working in schools, we have those charts with the emoticons and all the different images and smiles and faces. But if you think about it, many of our emotions really boil down to being mad, sad, glad, and scared. And secondary trauma can enhance these emotions with feelings of being overwhelmed, powerless, hypersensitive, or maybe even hopeless. Right? Those are really powerful descriptions and emotions. I'm going to repeat those again. Feelings of being overwhelmed, powerless, hypersensitive, or maybe even hopeless. There are physical impacts of STS. Again, as you read here on the slide, low energy, feeling fatigued, having an upset stomach or nausea, perhaps breathing difficulties, difficulty sleeping, maybe even feeling dizzy, right? So obviously with some of these symptoms, you're looking for medical help and attention, or you're taking it slow. You're taking some time to just rest, relax, and recuperate. There are behavioral impacts of secondary traumatic stress. You may change your routine of things. Your experience with appetite changes, or your behavior towards others at work or at home changes. The more severe impacts can be the use of self-destructive coping mechanisms like substance abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, excessive gambling, excessive shopping, right? And so what we're talking about here is when it's excessive, right? When it's not in moderation, that can be one of the behavioral impacts of secondary traumatic stress. And then the professional impact, you may experience low performance on job tasks and responsibilities. Your morale on the job can be low, or your relationships with colleagues may suffer, or you might just bring an attitude to work every day. So these are 4 of the life domain impacts. And again, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to check. It looks like some chats have come through. I'll do my best to get some of those answered. But let's take a minute to just in your own sort of reflection and space, if you can think about the impacts. And now I'd like you to think about, Leora referred to kind of where we are in society, where we are in our communities, in our conditions. We have, pandemics, we have coronavirus and COVID-19. We have racial injustices and Black Lives Matter. We have an upcoming election. So there are lots of different things. And then we have those of you working in schools, you're now kind of in the middle of this term in your school setting where a lot of things are happening for you and for the children and adolescents that you're working with. So as you think about this, someone once asked me, not once insofar as a long time ago, recently asked me, gosh, do you think with the advent of coronavirus and this pandemic, does that enhance our risk for STS? And I had to think about it for a while. And I suggested that, yeah, it does. And the reason why is because these feelings of sort of hopelessness or uncertainty can contribute to STS. And I think coronavirus is doing that because you turn on the news or you read something or you talk to someone and it's a different story every day. And you're not really sure where to go, where to turn. And as human beings, we want answers. And answers help us get to solutions. And when we have solutions, we feel comfortable, we feel safe, we feel like we can move forward. And when we don't have some of these solutions, it's confusing for us as human beings. And so, yeah, I'd like to think that some of these conditions can enhance our susceptibility to secondary traumatic stress. So again, I'm going to pause here, give you a minute to just think about some of these impacts and conditions, and then I'll continue with the next slide. Yep, some good stuff in here about admin and teachers. Yep. Yeah. So continuing with the impact of secondary trauma, let's talk about these three life domains. And again, I'll pause and ask you to spend some time reflecting. The cognitive impact. Okay, you might experience confusion, diminished concentration, difficulty with your decision-making skills, decreased self-esteem, self-doubt, blaming others. You might become hypervigilant or experience what we call trauma imagery, seeing events over and over and over again. Right? The spiritual impact. You might question the meaning of life, or you've lost your sense of purpose in the world. You may have a lack of self-satisfaction, or perhaps become angry at a higher power. Maybe even question your religious or spiritual beliefs. We don't often talk about our spirituality. And I understand that it's very intimate, it's very sensitive, but it's a very real thing for many of us. And when that's impacted, you can question your purpose and you can be angry at a higher power. When it's that higher power or that sense of purpose or meaning to life that can help us get through trying and troubling circumstances and times. So when SDS can impact that, it ruptures our ability to connect to that spiritual side of ourselves. The interpersonal impact, becoming physically withdrawn, emotionally unavailable to your coworkers or your family. You may have a decreased interest in intimacy or physical touch. You might even isolate yourself from family, friends, or support systems. You may become impatient or intolerant of others or situations around you. Right? So that's that interpersonal impact of secondary trauma. So similarly with the last slide, I'm going to stop here and just ask you to give some thought to some of what I've been describing thus far and ask yourself, wow, have I experienced some of these conditions?
Steve, if you're open to it, I think Angela's question might help to expand our understanding of secondary traumatic stress around. So her two questions, or Angela's two questions, do people tend to have only one domain affected or multiple? And is it considered more traumatic stressor if there are more domains impacted?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Angela. I think people can have more than one domain affected. Some of the domains have sort of similar conditions to them. So if you have difficulty with decision making, it may make it more challenging for you to have a positive relationship at work on a particular task or project. I think what's interesting for me is that, and I think we all should sort of agree that how trauma impacts us is very intimate and unique for us. And it's not up to us to kind of judge that, but more importantly, it's up to us to normalize and validate that that someone is experiencing trauma, and it takes, and to be patient and aware of that experience and how special that is to the individual experiencing it. The other question, let me see here. Can you just read out loud again, Lior, the other question?
Yeah, for sure. Is it considered more traumatic stressor if there are more domains impacted?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I could argue that yes, it could be considered more of a traumatic stressor. I don't know if I looked at it as more or less than, but that it's an additional traumatic stressor. And so it's important that we're paying attention to that and that we're aware of that. So we're thinking about one of the domains, and all of a sudden that might impact another domain. So now we have to consider that. And how are we going to take care of ourselves? And that's why the next chunk of slides are going to think about self-care, and I've mapped them onto each of these domains. So that if we're thinking about the cognitive or spiritual impact of trauma, then we have to think about how are we taking care of ourselves from a cognitive standpoint or from a spiritual standpoint. So I hope that gets at your question. Roxana asked, can I please share who the person's presentation? Yeah, so that was Dr. Robin Gurwitch. She's over at Duke University. She's awesome. Yeah, so if you run into her, say, I was in a presentation with Steve Hydon once, and he said, you said mad, sad, glad, and scared. So she's really great, really down to earth and fun to work with. So, okay. Keep the chats coming. And yeah, if there's something pressing, Leor, that you want me to cover more in depth, I can certainly do that. I'm going to move on now to the self-care portion. So here's what I've tried to set up for you, okay? And that is the understanding and definition of STS, why you might be at risk for STS, what are some signs to look for, and then what are the impacts of STS across these different life domains. And so if I'm going to share all this with you, then the least I could do is talk with you about, okay, so then what do we do about it? Like if I'm experiencing this, or if I have in the past, or I want to think about, gosh, as I move through my work, am I going to experience this in the future? And so I'm kind of now aware of it. You're starting to help me understand that this is a very real condition that exists. What are some things that I can do to mitigate its impact, to minimize its impact so that I can still work effectively? I'm also hoping that you're picking up on the fact that STS can impact us both professionally, okay, so in our working capacity, but also personally in our personal lives with loved ones and from family members and friends, or if you're active in the community in those types of ways, okay? So there are 6 domains listed on here, and I actually have a 7th one that I meant to put right in the center of this diagram, and that's the social domain. So I'll reference that just a little bit. So when we think about self-care, the first thing I'm going to do is ask you, how many people have heard the term self-care? Again, you can put it in the chat box or just ask yourself, have I ever heard the term self-care? So I'm just going to spend a second just to stop talking and think about that for a second. Okay. The reason why I asked you to do that, and I used to never do this, I've given presentations or variations of this presentation for several years. And a couple of years ago, I was doing a webinar with the Department of Education, and we started to talk about self-care. And the moderator said, listen, let's do a poll in this webinar and ask participants if they've ever heard the term self-care. And I kind of sent a private chat saying, oh, I think everybody's heard the term. Just go ahead and do it. And we did. And lo and behold, about 65% of the individuals heard of the term self-care. Another 25% or so kind of thought maybe, maybe not. And a smaller percentage had no idea what I meant by the term self-care. And so I thought to myself, gosh, then we really need to check in. And so self-care, I think, has carried a sort of an understanding or definition with many of us, but many of us are not familiar with. When I start to talk about self-care, which I'm about to do, we then start to say, oh, wait a minute, you mean hanging out with friends or going to the barbershop or going out to happy hour? Yeah, I've done that. Or reading, curling up with a good book, or catching up on my greatest, my favorite Netflix series. Yeah, I've done that. I didn't call it self-care. I just said hanging out with friends or having a glass of wine or watching TV, binge watching. And so I have to be mindful, and all of us have to be mindful that when we start thinking about self-care or maybe sharing that concept with other colleagues, that maybe not everyone knows what self-care means. There's some cultural definitions and understanding of self-care. And in some cultures or communities, we may not be thinking about self-care the way others might be thinking about self-care. self-care. So it's important to kind of think out loud and broadly and get a good understanding of what it is we mean by self-care. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through each of these sort of hexagons, if you will, and then I will review a seventh one. So physical self-care, what I'm talking about here is recognizing the need for physical activity, proper diet, and sleep. Okay. Lots of research out there. And how much sleep do we need? Is it 6 hours? Is it 8 hours? It could be one of those. We know it's more than 1 hour. So if you're one of those all-nighters, 1-2 hours, got to start thinking about how we can incorporate sleep into our regular routine of things. Okay. Someone once joked to me, self-care is more than eating broccoli and doing yoga, right? And so, yeah, I love broccoli, have my fair share of it. Used to actually do yoga with my mom in my formative years. And so wonderful things. But it's more than just some of those concepts. And that's why I have all these different domains populated on this slide. Intellectual self-care, recognizing creative ways to expand knowledge and skills, training, reading, courses. I mean, think what would happen if you were not intellectually stimulated for long periods of time. Okay. So by the very nature, so for those of you who say, oh, I don't have the time for self-care, the very nature that you're in this webinar is intellectual self-care. So surprise, you're actually participating in intellectual self-care as you participate and think about my comments with you today. Environmental self-care, we don't often think about that, but that we're ensuring that we're occupying pleasant and stimulating environments that support well-being and good health. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. And here's kind of back to the question about, could you experience the impact of multiple life domains? And I think my response was, yeah, I think maybe you could, because some of those domains interface with one another. Similarly with self-care, environmental and physical self-care. I was doing some training. Again, I mentioned I was a consultant with U.S. Department of Education, and we were in Joplin, Missouri, at around the cusp of the 2-year anniversary of the devastating tornado that had ravaged that area. And it was a very intimate group of about 20 school personnel. It was a Saturday morning. It's really great training. And we got to this piece about self-care, and I asked individuals to sort of share their self-care ideas. And there was a group of teachers that talked about how they would get together about 2 or 3 times a week, right in the morning at the school playground parking lot. And they would walk around the neighborhood. And there were a couple of rules to this group. They called themselves the Breakfast Club. It was awesome. And there were a couple of rules. They had to, obviously show up. They had to wear comfortable walking shoes, right? And then they couldn't talk about work or anything related to work while they were going through this, quarter, half-mile walk through the neighborhood. They could talk about what was the last movie you saw, what are you doing with the kids this weekend? And it was just this really great way to engage in self-care in these 2 different domains, the physical domain and then the environmental domain. We have emotional self-care, understanding ways to manage and cope with stress. Again, think about what would happen if we did not develop coping mechanisms to help us deal with stress. The social self-care. As humans, listen, we might want to spend some time alone, and that's perfectly okay. You come home, listen, or if you come, from a long day, you say to yourself, gosh, I want some time by myself. I don't want to be bothered, and that's okay. But in the end, we all want to be around people whom love us, whom we love, who we take care of, who take care of us. And so this emotional self-care is the need to stay connected to others and to have these well-defined support systems. Okay, the spiritual self-care, this ability to search for meaning and purpose in the human experience. So remember, I talked about the spirituality and the impact the STS has on our spiritual side. So now we have to think about, how are we taking care of ourselves from that spiritual domain, that spiritual aspect that we believe in, that we subscribe to. Occupational self-care. Right? What we mean here is obtaining personal satisfaction and enrichment derived from your work. Okay, personal satisfaction and enrichment derived from our work experience. Okay, imagine if we worked in environments that were dysfunctional or even toxic over long periods of time. That would really be a challenge for us. And so how are we changing our workspace, our environment, the work that we're doing. If we think about kind of many of us are now working from home, have you created work environments at your home? Some of us might have not been familiar with that. I haven't. I'm an in-classroom professor. And then last spring, I had to sort of migrate to this online platform. I had to get used to that. And I had to get used to making this environment pleasant and stimulating. And now it is. I've got my coffee next to me. I've got my water. I'm in a comfortable chair. I've got the air conditioning on. And so I'm now occupying this pleasant and stimulating environment for work. So I had to pivot and make a shift in how we create that pleasant workspace. Again, I'm going to stop here and just ask you to think about these self-care domains just for a second. So I see the self and collective care. It's really, really wonderful. I think it was Ken who indicated that. Yeah, there's some concepts out there that now posit that. How are we taking care of ourselves collectively as a group? Where's the organizational responsibility to ensure that self-care is important, that it's recognized, that it's valued? Right. So really some really good ideas and thinking around that. Are we taking the time off that we need to? Are we taking advantage of our supervision? If we have a sick day, are we using our sick days or our vacation days? Are we doing all the things necessary to take care of ourselves in the work environment? And how are we doing things together? Again, I was doing some work outside of in New Jersey, and some groups of colleagues would host these potluck dinners. And once a month, they would get together, or maybe quarterly, and they would get together. And they came up to me and they said, "Hey, Steve, what do you think about this? We get together once a month or so, or once every few months, and we share, break bread, and we just have some conversation. What are some of your thoughts?" And I thought it was great. What I said was, be careful that the conversation doesn't migrate towards commiserating, right? That we're keeping the conversation healthy and focused and positive, and that we're not sort of saying, "Gosh, I don't like this," or "I don't like that." If you can keep it upbeat, if you can keep it, as Leora said, jazzed up with something really exciting and wonderful to talk about, then yeah, I think that's a great opportunity to engage in that collective self-care. Okay, I'm going to move on to another slide here. So if we're going to talk about self-care, I always like to think about what are some barriers to self-care. Okay, what are some things that prevent us from getting? And if we had some time, I would stop and say, okay, and have everybody share out. Imagine many of you would come up with the same barriers. First of all, feeling guilty, right? I feel guilty that I'm taking care of myself and not taking care of the work that at hand, or taking care of my children, or taking care of my voter registration booth, whatever that is, right? But when we start to feel guilty, we start to kind of blame ourselves for saying, wait a minute, I have to take care of myself. Like, if I'm not my best self, I'm not doing my best work. So we have to start giving ourselves permission, okay, to accepting the fact that it's okay for us to take care of ourselves. Again, I mentioned earlier that there's now some literature out there on self-accountability, that we have to give ourselves permission, and we're almost have to hold ourselves accountable and responsible to take care of ourselves. And that if that hasn't worked in the past, we have to own that, right? And we have to accept the fact that maybe we've tried, and now we have to try different ways of doing things. And that leads me to motivation, right? And so this concept around, are we motivated to engage in self-care? I think about motivation in kind of these three categories. Active choice. We actually actively have to choose to engage in some type of self-care plan. Mental effort. What I mean by that is, do we have the know-how, the skill sets to engage in the self-care plan, and then to actually do what we're indicating in that plan? So if we're going to go out and say, I'm going to lift weights for a minute. Well, okay. Do you know how to lift weights? Have you lifted weights before? Do you know sort of, what that looks like? It might sound simple, but if we're going to think about these different ways of motivating ourselves, we have to have the mental effort, or we might be doing things incorrectly. And so we have to shift and change the way we're doing things so that we can do them correctly. And then the other concept, so there's mental effort, active choice, and then persistence, that grit, that stick-to-itiveness. Again, that getting up the 10th time after you've been knocked down a 9th time. That's how I think about motivation. And then one of the barriers is time. I don't have the time. Well, for me, and this leads to the second, the right-hand column, which is, how do we have success with self-care? Well, the first thing is, we want to make self-care manageable and measurable. And so if we're thinking about, okay, let me build in some time, let me make self-care more routine, more habitual. So I want to start to exercise more. Well, exercise is a very huge category. So what do we mean? Well, I'm going to walk a little bit more. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. How often are you going to walk? Ah, gosh, I'm going to try once a week. Great. Now we're on to something. What day of the week? Oh gosh, I don't know. Tuesdays. Terrific. What time? 7 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning. What I'm getting at here is making self-care something that it's a goal that can be broken down into measurable and manageable parts, and that there's a person responsible and that it's time bound. So you're going to walk for 20 minutes every Tuesday for the next month. And then when you build these self-care plans, what you want to do is think about contracting with someone. What I mean by that is you might sit down and say, you know what, I was listening to this workshop with this Steve Hydon guy, and he started talking about measurable and manageable self-care goals. And I'm going to start writing these down. And there's a bunch of, you could Google self-care plans. There's a bunch of plans out there. And I'm going to start writing down one of these goals. And I want to give this contract to one of my friends, or to a spouse, or a significant other, a coworker. And I'm going to say, hey, listen, John, I'm giving you this contract. I'm going to commit to walking 20 minutes every Tuesday for the next month. In a month or in a couple of weeks, I want you to text me or call me and say, hey, Steve, you said you were going to do this Tuesday mornings. Did you do it? And if so, great. Tell me about it. And if not, that's okay too. What got in the way, and how can we begin to eliminate some of those barriers so you can accomplish your goal moving forward? So when we talk about contracts, that's what I'm referencing, that we have these self-care plans, they're populated with measurable and manageable objectives, and that we're sharing these plans with others. The significant others piece is we're hoping that the people around us, the people whom are close to us, whom we live with, are going to know that we're now engaging in kind of this new self-care plan. Love for you to participate, but if not, I'm hoping that you can support me. I'm hoping that you can support this idea that I want to start taking care of myself across these different life domains. And when I say across these different life domains, let's not overwhelm ourselves. We don't have to engage in self-care across all 6 or all 7. We might blend a couple, or we might tackle 1 or 2 at a time and look at our success and evaluate and assess how well we did in some of those activities. Right. And so that we think about it from more of not this whole, oh my gosh, I have to do everything all at once, but that we think about it again in these small little increments of time and measurable objectives. And group work gets a little bit more of that collective self-care that was brought up a little bit earlier. And that is, can we work with others? Are there others that have similar or like interests that we might be able to engage in self-care activities with? Or are there others that are doing things that you always thought about? Like there's these new mirrors out there and these Pelotons, and I've thought about them, but I've never really tried them. But I've got a friend of mine who has. And so, you know what, Barry, hey, you told me you have this Peloton bike. How does that work? Like, do you have to have internet? Do you have to have a live class? Can you do a recorded class? The idea here is that you're sharing ideas with others who you trust, whom you're comfortable with, so you can either do them together or you can learn from others. Again, that's that motivation piece. That's that mental effort, maybe relearning how you've been doing things kind of differently. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Again, think about the self-care. I'm going to do one piece here on pillars of thriving, and then I'm going to move into the online platform that I referenced at the beginning of my comments. So Dr. Rosenstein is an associate vice provost here at USC. And I was in a presentation with her a couple of years ago, and she talked about these 5 pillars of thriving, which I thought were just really kind of powerful and profound. One is handling and accepting positive emotions, maybe even handling and accepting other emotions, but that we know that emotions happen, we all have them. And so it's handling them and accepting them and knowing what to do with our, especially all of our emotions, but in particular, our positive emotions. Engaging with others, we've talked about that. Here in the era of COVID-19, we have sort of isolated ourselves. In fact, if you're in the social work profession, there are sort of 12 grand challenges of social work. And one of them is to eliminate social isolation. Well, that's kind of hard to do here with COVID-19. So how are we finding ways to still engage? Are we doing that through FaceTime? Are we doing that through actual letters? Are we doing that through text messaging? Are we having drive-by birthday parties? Or last spring, I was seeing in our neighborhood drive-by graduation parties. And so we were being safe, we were socially distancing ourselves, but we were still engaging with others. My family lives back east, and so on the major holidays thus far, Mother's Day, Easter, I think even 4th of July, we did a Zoom FaceTime call, and it was wonderful, and it was a way to kind of engage. So engaging with others, seeking out positive relationships, right? So we don't want necessarily these unwelcoming, these unsavory, these unsatisfactory relationships. We want healthy, positive relationships with the people, again, whom love us, who know us, who we want to be around, who we enjoy being around. Ascribing meaning to what we do, right? Ascribing purpose and meaning and intention to what it is that we're doing, both in the professional capacity and in our personal capacity. And then recognizing tasks, great or small. This has a lot to do with the self-care pieces. So if we say we're going to jog for 20 minutes and maybe we only did 15 minutes, great. We're still acknowledging that accomplishment. We're making ourselves feel better and recognizing that we actually achieved and accomplished something. Okay. So here's where I'm going to kind of toggle back and forth. Not kind of, I will toggle back and forth between my slide deck and this this online platform that I want to share with you. And we'll spend the next 15 minutes or so going through this portion of the presentation. So a few years ago, I recruited, and I'll get to who I recruited. I was funded in I'm part of a TSA, Trauma Services Adaptation Center, SAMHSA funded grant. And we received some supplemental funding to create this online platform that looks at secondary traumatic stress and its impact. At the time, it was on its impact on school teachers and educators, but we learned through feedback and through pilot testing that it actually has relevance and applicability to anybody working in a school. So this web link is statprogram.org. So that's www.statprogram.org. And STAT stands for Support for Teachers Affected by Trauma. And it was a partnership with UCLA, University of Montana, colleagues of mine at USC, 3C Institute, which is kind of this technology platform, and then RAND Corporation. It's a 5-module curriculum that walks us through, and I'm going to show you some of these modules online, but it walks us through a lot of the components that I just shared with you in my conversation with you today. So it looks at kind of an overview of secondary trauma. It looks at the symptoms of STS. It differentiates secondary trauma from vicarious trauma, from compassion fatigue, some of these other kind of associated phenomena. And it begins to help frame the participants with what we mean by STS and what symptoms they might experience if they're experiencing secondary traumatic stress. With like many adult learning platforms, if you've seen them before, you sort of have to take them sequentially. So you have to finish one module or one chapter before you can go to the next one. With this particular STAT program, we didn't do that. Only the first one is mandatory, and then you can kind of jump around to the different modules, whichever ones you seem fit. You might be familiar with kind of the impact of STS, but you really want to get to the self-care, so you can kind of move around at your leisure. Once you create a profile of yourself in STS on the STAT program, what I mean by that is, in order to it's a free program. But in order to get access to it, you have to register. And we simply just ask for some demographics, where you work, populations you work with, your name, and your, just so that we know who you are. But then that's kind of good for life, right? You'll be able to access this program whenever you want. And that's important because I'm going to show you a little bit later the self-care module and how you can actually build self-care plans and access those plans at a future time. So here, I'm going to actually stop sharing, and I'm actually going to play with you one of these modules. So we talk about risk factors, the student populations, personal characteristic traits, and the school environment. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing here, and I'm going to start sharing this. So I have this kind of predetermined, so hopefully this will work. So I'm going to play module 2, and I'm just going to play the beginning so you kind of get a sense of what it looks like and the functionality of it, what to expect, I can share with you that in each of the modules, we'll have some narration and you'll actually see our narrator, or sometimes it'll be a voiceover. We've got some drag and drop, so there'll be some question and answers, and you can kind of answer the questions and drag them into the right spaces. We actually have vignettes, and so there's kind of these caricature vignettes where you'll see people experiencing conditions of STS and what do we do about it. We've got some live, well, not live, but recorded actual teacher testimonies on how STS has impacted them, and then how they've taken care of themselves. So I'll kind of get a chance during the next time to show you some of these different components of it. So let's see here. I'll play from.
In Module 1, we learned about the concept of secondary traumatic stress, STS, and its associated symptoms, such as nightmares, problems concentrating, avoidance of places or things that recall the trauma, and negative changes in mood. In this module, we'll build on what we've discussed by looking at risk factors that make teachers especially vulnerable to developing STS. As we discussed in Module 1, trauma exposure can be very common, averaging about 60% nationally. In some schools, that number is far higher. Teachers are in a unique position to develop trusting relationships with students, so it's likely that at some point, a student who has or is currently experiencing trauma will turn to us for support or comfort. Although hearing about these traumatic events doesn't always result in the development of secondary traumatic stress, it dramatically increases the odds that we will experience at least some symptoms of STS. So it's important to understand the risk factors specific to our profession and to us as individuals. The 3 risk factors we'll discuss here relate to the student populations we teach, our personal characteristics, and the school environments in which we work. At the conclusion of this module, you'll be able to recognize the specific risk factors relevant to your workplace, as well as the personal character traits that may make you vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress.
And so here, you could start to think about your own personal characteristics. And then here's one of the drag and drops, and you literally can just drag and drop this in here. And then what will happen is at the end, there are some other series of questions, and the your responses will become populated in a graphic that you'll be able to actually take away with you. So let me show you that. Yeah, and so right here, you'll be able to see the factors relevant to you, your personal characteristics and school environment, and you can actually download this and take this with you. So that's the second module. But let me share with you a little bit about the third module. Looks at an assessment of secondary traumatic stress. I'll share with you what this module looks like. Hold on just a second. And so this module, what we do is it's called My Stat Level, and it asks participants to actually assess their sort of, not their understanding, but if they're actually experiencing STS. And it is chunked out according to Dr. Brian Bride et al., sort of his colleagues' secondary traumatic stress scale. And so that looks at secondary trauma from, again, these areas of thought intrusion, avoidance, and arousal. And if you can see here in these graphs, you not only get an overall score in each of these components, but then it's broken down into where you scored based on your answers to this scale in these categories of intrusion, avoidance, and arousal. And what it does is it breaks it down into even color-coded graphics. So at the top right-hand corner, you're going to see that if you kind of answer and your responses put you in the green category, then you're doing okay. You're not really experiencing STS. The blue category means perhaps you have mild symptoms, and then you can see where we get to the red category, and that you are experiencing STS, and we want to ask you to consider things to do about it. And we have a reference page at the end. Let me show you a little bit about this particular module. I've got some.
My Stat Level uses a version of a common STS questionnaire created by Brian Bride and his colleagues. We've adapted Dr. Bride's questionnaire for use by teachers and other school staff. It comprises 17 items that ask about common symptoms of STS. Your MyStat level score will correspond to one of 5 colors, each of which represents the severity of STS you are experiencing. To gain further insight into options for self-care, please refer to Module 5. The green level means that you have little or no STS at this time. For teachers at the green level, we recommend retaking MyStat level once per year or sooner if you have a secondary traumatic experience with a student or someone else.
I'm going to move us further. And then here, you actually can take the MyStat assessment level up to 3 times. It's encouraged as well. She indicated if you fell in the green range, then maybe you take it at the end of the school year. I like to think you take it maybe at the beginning of the school year, sometimes during the middle, and then sometime towards the end. And this last looks at, again, these different components. And so however you've answered the questions, it will populate your responses here and will give you an indication of where you are. And it actually gives you sort of these STS areas, again, broken down into intrusion. So that's sort of thought intrusion, thinking about clients over and over time or pupils you're working with, thinking about the stories that you've heard even after you've left work. Avoidance, maybe you're avoiding places that remind you of traumatizing events, or again, things that you've heard or you've listened to. And then this arousal, constantly feeling on edge, that sense of being hypervigilant, which I talked about a little bit earlier in some of my comments. Okay, the fourth, and I'm going to go through these next 2, and then I'll open it up for any questions. The fourth module asks you to look at, so that's the impact. So remember, I talked about the 7 life domains and the impact STS has on each of those life domains. So let me share with you some work around the 4th module and what we have together for you in the program here. So I'm just going to play one of these.
Secondary traumatic stress can make it more difficult to regulate our emotions. Situations we would normally move through easily or react to with mild sadness, irritation, or anxiety can start to feel overwhelming. We may become hypersensitive to others' comments and feel criticized, or we may have excessive worries, even though we rationally know we shouldn't be worried. We may find that minor problems or disagreements make us disproportionately angry, leading to arguments with family, friends, co-workers, or even a cashier at the local market. We may dream about the traumatic experiences our students have shared with us, or find our waking thoughts returning again and again to the events they've described. Everyday events and actions may start to remind us of these traumas, such as witnessing a negative interaction between a parent and a child, passing by a place where we know a traumatic event occurred, or hearing a story that brings the traumatic experience to mind. These sorts of mental intrusions can in turn cause other problems. We may have trouble concentrating or fully engaging in activities we normally enjoy. We may find ourselves fixating on trying to solve our students' problems. Difficulty coping with these uncomfortable emotions, particularly if we don't fully understand why we're experiencing them, may lead to misuse of alcohol or drugs in an attempt to self-medicate. 2 weeks ago, one of Robin's students shared that her father had started an argument with her mother and shoved her against a wall. The student was worried for her mother and unsure what to do. Robin reported her student's situation to the proper authorities. Robin usually prides herself on welcoming constructive feedback about her work, but in the weeks since her student confided in her, she's been brought to tears more than once by suggestions left on walkthrough forums and is beginning to feel overwhelmed by her daily duties. She especially dreads the end of the day when all of the teachers lead their students downstairs to the auditorium to wait for their parents. The noise level grates on her nerves, and she finds herself frantically scanning the space for faces she doesn't recognize, fearful that someone will enter the auditorium intending to hurt students or staff members. At home, Robin has been uncharacteristically irritable with her husband and has started drinking several glasses of wine at night to cope with her feelings of anxiety.
So that would have gone on to ask you, the next page is a worksheet, and it would ask you to populate the worksheet with some of the signs that Robin is experiencing kind of this emotional impact of secondary trauma. For purposes of time, I won't play one of these teacher interviews, but what we have in here, we recorded them in Washington, D.C. when we were there for a conference, and we actually asked them to think about the impact that STS has on them as teachers. So these are real live interviews that we've recorded and that you can play at your leisure. And then the last module is, hold on just a second, is module 5, which is our self-care module. You knew where I was going with that. I just believe in the importance of self-care. I'll just share with you briefly something that we have on this module. And so here we've got these different, again, here are these life domains and the impact of these life domains. And then if we're thinking about the impact of STS, how are we taking care of ourselves in each of these particular life domains? I'll just click on one.
When people think about practicing better self-care, they often think first of the physical domain, probably because it's the simplest domain in which to introduce self-care habits. In fact, most of us already know what good physical self-care looks like. Having a regular sleep routine, engaging in healthy eating habits, and getting some kind of exercise, such as going for a walk with a friend after work a few times a week, are all examples of relatively small changes that can have a big impact on our ability to deal with the challenges we face in daily life.
So yeah, so here's your self-care plan, and it's kind of one of those SMART goals. So is your goal specific? Is it measurable? Right. And then as you're filling this out online, it actually populates this self-care plan. So you can download it, take it with you, contract with others, share it with your significant other, so that everyone who's around you, who cares about you, is aware that you like to build and engage in a self-care plan, and you have it readily available. You can always refer to it. It will be up there in your program, so you can always change it. There's nothing wrong with doing that as well. So I'm just about out of time here. Just wanted to share with you some of the components and tenets of that particular program. Okay, I'm going to ask Leora to jump back in here, and let's see here. Okay, there you are.
I'm here. And I don't know if you want to come back on video too, Steve.
Yeah, hold on.
First of all, I want to really thank you so much for guiding us through not only the framework, but also a tangible tool that we can use. I know many of us, even though we're not classroom teachers, we in some way, shape, or form impact and support and are accountable with and to and from the teaching profession. And I think that STAT can be used not just for educators, classroom teachers, but for all school mental health professionals. So thank you so much. And I want to open it. We don't have any questions in the Q&A box, but I think that this is the time, particularly for folks who are with us for the next 10-ish minutes, to source questions or comments. And particularly, we'd really like to hear about, how does this work land with you in this moment of pandemic and in this moment of 7 months of pandemic and this moment of many of you are doing virtual care provision, virtual school mental health provision. So how is this landing for you? And Steve, maybe while people are putting the comments in the chat box, maybe you can share some learnings around how this conversation around secondary traumatic stress for educators has been contextualized in this moment.
Yeah, well, so I think what's happening is that we have to have a complete shift in our approach to working with pupils or clients in that school setting. So we're now doing virtual, telehealth programs or virtual, conferences, therapeutic sessions. And how are we doing that, managing our own lives? While I was giving this presentation, you may or may not heard that my wife walked in with our son and was getting something out of the fridge. And I wanted to say, hey, I had to do this. I'm in the middle, but what can I do? He's hungry and she had to come home. And so how are we taking care of ourselves, and how are we taking care of these traumas? That wasn't traumatic, but how are we taking care of these stories that we're listening to in our very own homes? Usually we're at work and we like to keep work at work. And many of us are now bringing that work into our home space. And so how are we separating our home space with our life, with our workspace? Is there a blend? Are they spilling over into one another? So I know it seems sort of weird to think about it like that, but if we start thinking about this physical capacity and how we're hearing stories, and then you're asking me to hear the story, work with a client, and then I have to go make dinner 10 feet away and provide for my family, to separate that makes it even more challenging. So I ask us to be mindful, thoughtful, intentional, creative, and patient with how we're doing that work.
I'm so grateful you said that. And I think that's so indicative of the wheel that you demonstrated, and how it's easy for us to concentrate on one piece of that wheel, but knowing that this moment is actually compressing all of those together, the emotional, the physical, the spiritual, all of it together. One of the pieces that came up in a recent conversation, and I'm looking at the chat box to get some feedback from all of you. But one of the pieces that came up recently was, how are we as educators not only providing the teaching, but also then oftentimes being the teachers, the co-teachers for the young ones in our household. And that dual role of being both the provider and the teacher and the holder. And so there's a lot of compressed systems in our bodies right now, collectively and individually.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Leora. And, you're right. I think STAT and all of this work, but STAT in particular, has relevance to any helping profession, right? It was, like I said, we thought about it from the teacher perspective, but as we want to do a STAT too, and really sort of infuse the organizational perspective, the leadership, the district level perspective, and how, if we're thinking about STS, we have to be thinking about all those individuals working. But the piece about teachers is interesting, because teachers are now being asked to do some of those mental health activities. They're being responsible for the emotions and the traumatic experiences that students are bringing into that classroom. And as helping professions and mental health workers in schools, we have to be aware of that and cognizant of that. And how can we partner with our teachers to do really good work?
Thank you. Yeah. Adrian's saying in the chat box that STS awareness, so secondary traumatic stress awareness, is a vital, useful tool, great insight and understanding to the new normal, which is ongoing and ever changing. And the invitation for us to breathe. And the other reminder is that some of us have been using the phrase new normal, and some of us, this actually just feels like an amplified version of what was happening before March.
Yeah.
So it is, depending on our context and our positionality and our role, many of us have been doing multiple layers of help providing for many years and lifetimes and generations.
Yeah. And to that point, and we're never going to go back to the old way of doing things, right? And in many ways, as we think about some of these other pandemics, right? Like we kind of don't want to. Like, we have to move forward to some new ways of thinking, new ways of doing business, new ways of taking care of each other and one another. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to invite, as we move into closing, I'm going to invite everyone, even if you are just listening from your kitchen, or you're somewhere else in the house, or you're like Steve's wife and coming in and out of getting food, wherever you are, if you might take a moment to come to the screen and in the chat box where it says panelists and attendees, to offer one takeaway, just one, not a dissertation, just one takeaway that you're walking away with today. And I'm starting with Susan, who's saying, as hard as it is to do right now, we need to be creative and wondering how we can decrease stress by bringing student teachers forward to assist the cognitive load. They're so gifted with how to connect in virtual conditions. Thank you. And Sochin is also offering the STAT program as one takeaway.
Yeah, I'm reading it now. This is great.
Yeah, the domains of self-care. Care for all moment by moment. To share a self-care plan with loved ones so that we may be supported and encouraged in our efforts. Yes, so lots of interdependence and accountability. Yes, thank you. A plan for our own self-care, and the only way to help others is to help ourselves first, the plan of self-care. So that's a big resonance with really articulating. And just, by the way, just like we would with our students that we support who are in mental health distress, or even just prevention, of having a plan for support. So too for us, right? Yes, so a reminder of the importance of how we care for our social wellness, and learn to cut off the computer and take more time for myself.
That's right. I
We
love
will do
that.
that in 8 minutes. All of us will do that in 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
My wife and I are trying this whole 7 to 7 rule. After 7 o'clock, you shut it down. Like work is going to be there at 7 in the morning. So let's shut it down and connect in other ways. Yeah.
I have a colleague who just set up an automatic out of office email reply after 7. So that just as though she was in a conference. Okay. So I'm going to read a couple more and then we're going to move into closing.
Okay.
I really appreciate the takeaway that we all don't know what self-care is or looks like or feels like, or even collective care, what that looks like or feels like. So this is the time to really start to have critical conversations and unearth what that feels like and looks like, both in practice and then in systems, so that we can then create multi-tiered systems of support. And I just want to say this for everyone, again, to remember that in PBIS, MTSS, in any tiered system, it's not just for the students. It's systems of support for us to create schools as the platform for health and for wellness and for regulation, so that we can think and feel at the same time and make meaning of the lives around us. So we too are in that multi-tiered system of support. We're both providing and we're also to be provided for in all of the systems in which we work.
Sure. Yeah.
So with that, we are going to move into closing. And so again, I'm going to ask Megan to put up the evaluation link. Steve, you're going to help me with the closing slides. Thank you for this. So let's look ahead. If we move into closing, we're going to look ahead and I'm just going to kind of like head nod you. Okay, great. So I just want to remind you, number one is that we have multiple sessions coming up. Steve will be back in a couple weeks. And we really encourage you to join these sessions as a team, even if you're watching from different places, that you join as a team so that you can then either pre-brief or debrief as a team, and then come together to think about like what resonates, what needed more inquiry, more discovery, and how might you need more technical assistance to further support you, either from the Northwest MHTTC, from the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, from Steve's body of work, that's down below, the Treatment Services and Adaptation Center, TSA, traumaawareschools.org. So those 3 questions: what resonated, what needs more, and what further supports can help you get there. And then of course we want to encourage you to take that deeper dive into the brand new implementation guide that was just released. So that it's hyperlinked up and you'll get that in the follow-up. Okay, this is just a resource that we wanted to let you know. Steve, myself, a couple other folks published this now 3 years ago. Time is flying past fast. So this is a good, thank you, Megan. So this is a good resource for you if you're interested in thinking about how to reduce the impact of secondary trauma on the frontline human services staff. And by the way, we as educators and school mental health professionals are human services staff. We are in the work of the humans of the servicing. So just wanted to amp this up because it's a way to think about not just educator wellness, again, at the individual, but at the organizational level. And then we can move forward, Steve. Thanks. Okay, so up next. So this week we just finished Module 1. We'll move into Module 2 on the 27th. Susan Barrett will kick us off with Interconnected Systems Framework and Trauma-Informed Approaches. And then we'll get some good work from other University of Southern California colleagues of Steve's team, thinking about psychological first aid adapted to the virtual times and trauma-informed skills for educators adapted to the virtual times. And then, as I said, in November, we'll do a deeper dive into tiers 2 and 3, both at the systems level and at the practice level, intervention level. And then in January, we'll come back together to do some really important work around the intersections of this work systemically and in our practices around equity. And then we'll close at the end of January with a town hall with both Susan Barrett and the USC team to come to think about your questions and answers live to get some conversation going around systems and practices in this moment. So we hope that you join us for some or all. They'll be recorded. And again, big thanks to Steve. I'm going to have you go forward one more time. So if you have any questions, you can contact us at the Pacific Southwest MHTTC or Kelsey and Megan's team at the Northwest MHTTC team. Whoever reminded all of us to breathe, I'm going to breathe with you. We hope that you hydrate yourself. We hope that you know that you've got a lot of resources out there to support you in this big time, in this big moment. And that practices are really, really held and well done when we do them, and even better when we do them together. So again, we might be separated in the computer, but we're together in the commitment to this work. Big thank you to Steve, and what a beautiful conversation. Just felt really conversational, Steve. So thank you so much. And we're grateful to all of you for being with us today. We will see you for Module 3. This starts on the 27th, and we're wishing you an evening or afternoon of a lot of regulation, a lot of support and resourcing and regulation. Be well, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.